In the early 1800s, the United States was a young nation growing quickly. White settlers wanted more land and looked towards Native American territories. Andrew Jackson became a prominent figure known as an Indian fighter. He believed in westward expansion and promised to open native lands for settlement. In 1830, the Indian Removal Act became law, strongly supported by Jackson. The act marked the beginning of a tragic era of forced migration, driven by greed. The United States government used many legal tricks to enforce removal. Treaties were often fraudulent, with signatures obtained through bribery or from unauthorized individuals. Government agents pressured and deceived tribal leaders. The United States court system frequently sided with state governments, undermining tribal sovereignty. Political pressure was another powerful tool, with states like Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi passing laws extending their authority over native territories. President Jackson supported these states' actions, weakening tribal autonomy. Military force was a constant threat, with the United States Army enforcing removal. Soldiers were stationed in or near native communities to intimidate them into leaving. When tribes resisted, the military used violence and fear to ensure compliance. Economic coercion also forced native nations to submit, with the government encouraging the destruction of native property. Bribes were offered to a few leaders to sign removal treaties, creating economic hardship and dependency. The entire system was designed to make continued resistance impossible. Resistance to the Indian Removal Act was widespread. Many tribes fought fiercely to protect their ancestral lands, using various methods to stop the removals. The Cherokee Nation provides a powerful example of legal resistance. They created a written language, established a government, and took their case against Georgia's oppressive laws to the Supreme Court. In the 1832 case Worcester vs. Georgia, the court ruled in their favor, but President Jackson ignored the ruling. In Florida, the Seminole people chose armed resistance, fighting several long and difficult wars against the United States Army. Leaders like Osceola became famous for their bravery and skill, using Florida's swamps and terrain to their advantage. While many Seminoles were eventually removed, a significant number successfully resisted. Other tribes also resisted in various ways, sending petitions and delegations to Washington, D.C. Some leaders, like Tecumseh, tried to build intertribal alliances. However, these efforts were largely unsuccessful, as the political and economic forces demanding native land were too powerful. The forced relocations were journeys of immense suffering. Thousands of native people were driven from their homes by soldiers, often with very little time to gather their belongings. The marches to the west were long and incredibly difficult, with people walking hundreds of miles over rough terrain. The Trail of Tears is the name most famously associated with the Cherokee removal. In 1838 and 1839, about 16,000 Cherokee people were forcibly marched westward. It is estimated that at least 4,000 Cherokee men, women, and children died from disease, starvation, and exposure during the journey. While the Cherokee experience is well known, other tribes endured similar horrors. The Choctaw, Muskogee Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole nations also faced devastating forced marches. The scale of human suffering was immense across all the removed nations. The United States government showed appalling neglect, with promised supplies often insufficient or of poor quality. Corrupt contractors and government officials often profited from the misery of native people. The government's primary goal was removal, not the well-being of those being removed. The Indian Removal Act had devastating long-term impacts on Native American communities. The loss of life during the removals was catastrophic for many tribes. Forced displacement severed deep cultural and spiritual connections. Tribes often found themselves on unfamiliar and less fertile land. This made traditional subsistence practices difficult. The trauma of removal has been passed down through generations. The economic and social consequences were profound and lasting. Many tribes became dependent on inadequate government rations. Health disparities and social distress became widespread issues. Most contemporary historians argue it was indeed ethnic cleansing. The Indian Removal Act holds a dark place in United States history. Acknowledging this painful past is necessary for a just understanding of American identity. During the colonial history of the United States, many colonists felt their civilization to be superior to that of the Indians due to their own notions of private property as a superior system of land tenure in addition to their Christian practices. Colonial and frontier encroachers inflicted a practice of cultural assimilation, meaning that tribes such as the Cherokee were forced to adopt aspects of white civilization. This acculturation was originally proposed by George Washington and was well underway among the Cherokee and the Choctaw by the beginning of the 19th century. Native peoples were encouraged to adopt European customs. First, they were forced to convert to Christianity and abandon traditional religious practices. They were also required to learn to speak and read English, although there was interest in creating a writing and printing system for a few native languages, especially Cherokee, exemplified by Sequoyah's Cherokee syllabary. The Native Americans also had to adopt settler values such as monogamous marriage and abandon non-marital sex. Finally, they had to accept the concept of individual ownership of land and other property, including, in some instances, African people as slaves. Many Cherokee people adopted all or some of these practices, including Cherokee Chief John Ross, John Ridge, and Elias Boudinot, as represented by the newspaper he edited, the Cherokee Phoenix. The Indian Removal Act, signed into law on May 28, 1830, authorized the forced relocation of Native American tribes from their lands east of the Mississippi River to a designated area known as Indian Territory, which is now eastern Oklahoma. This policy led to the removal of thousands of Native Americans, including the Cherokee, Choctaw, and Seminole tribes, on forced marches known as the Trail of Tears. The Indian Removal Act aimed to create a larger Indian Territory west of the Mississippi River to accommodate the relocated tribes. The goal was to remove Native Americans from states and territories that were being expanded, often through forced treaties or military action. The forced removal resulted in significant hardship and loss of life for many Native Americans, with the Trail of Tears being a prime example of the brutal conditions they faced during the relocation. While the Indian Removal Act specifically targeted tribes in the eastern United States, the policy had a broader impact on Native American communities across the country, including those in Florida, Georgia, Mississippi, and other locations. The Indian Removal Act, 1830, was enforced using a combination of legal maneuvering, military force, and political pressure. Tribes like the Cherokee initially tried to resist through legal challenges and diplomacy, but ultimately faced the force of the U.S. military and state militias. The Cherokee Nation unsuccessfully tried to fight the act through the Supreme Court, but President Jackson refused to abide by the court's decisions. The Cherokee were forcibly removed from their land in 1838 and 1839 by the U.S. military and Georgia state militia, an event known as the Trail of Tears. The Indian Removal Act was passed by Congress, demonstrating the political will to forcibly relocate Native Americans. Some tribes like the Seminole fought outright wars, the Second and Third Seminole Wars, to resist their removal. The force used against Native Americans during the Indian Removal Act was multifaceted, including military force, threats, deception, and legal manipulation. The act itself authorized the use of federal resources, including military personnel, to facilitate the displacement of Native American tribes. In some cases, the government violated treaties and Supreme Court rulings to achieve removal, according to the Office of the Historian. The U.S. Army was deployed to forcibly remove Native Americans from their lands, using tactics like roundups and detentions in stockades. Troops were armed with bayonets and, in some cases, the military escorted Native Americans on their forced marches west. The government used threats and deceptive tactics to coerce Native Americans into signing removal treaties. For example, a small group of Seminoles was coerced into signing a removal treaty in 1833, but the majority of the tribe declared it illegitimate and refused to leave, violation of treaties and Supreme Court rulings. In some instances, the government violated both treaties and Supreme Court rulings to facilitate removal, pushing westward across the continent, says the Office of the Historian. The Indian Removal Act itself, along with state laws, provided a legal framework for removing Native Americans. For example, the state of Georgia passed laws to justify removing white missionaries who were helping Indians resist removal. Forced marches Native Americans were forcibly marched west, often under harsh conditions, leading to significant loss of life, as described by the National Museum of the American Indian. Despite the force used, many Native Americans resisted removal, leading to conflicts like the Seminole Wars, as explained by Khan Academy. The Indian Removal Act was put in place to annex native land and then transfer that ownership to southern states, especially Georgia. The act was passed in 1830, although dialogue had been ongoing since 1802 between Georgia and the federal government concerning the possibility of such an act. Ethan Davis states that the federal government had promised Georgia that it would extinguish Indian title within the state's borders by purchase as soon as such purchase could be made upon reasonable terms. As time passed, southern states began to speed up the expulsions by claiming that the deal between Georgia and the federal government was invalid and that southern states could pass laws extinguishing Indian title themselves. In response, the federal government passed the Indian Removal Act on May 28, 1830, in which President Jackson agreed to divide the United States territory west of the Mississippi River into districts for tribes to replace the land from which they were removed. In the 1823 case of Johnson v. McIntosh, the United States Supreme Court handed down a decision stating that Indians could occupy and control lands within the United States but could not hold title to those lands. Jackson viewed the Union as a federation of highly esteemed states, as was common before the American Civil War. He opposed Washington's policy of establishing treaties with Indian tribes as if they were sovereign foreign nations. Thus, the creation of Indian jurisdictions was a violation of state sovereignty under Article 4, Section 3 of the Constitution. As Jackson saw it, either Indians comprised sovereign states, which violated the Constitution, or were subject to the laws of existing states of the Union. Jackson urged Indians to assimilate and obey state laws. Further, he believed he could only accommodate the desire for native self-rule in federal territories, which required resettlement on federal lands west of the Mississippi River. Humanity has often wept over the fate of the Aborigines of this country, and philanthropy has long been busily employed in devising means to avert it, but its progress never has for a moment been arrested, and one by one have many powerful tribes disappeared from the earth. But true philanthropy reconciles the mind to these vicissitudes as it does to the extinction of one generation to make room for another. In the monuments and fortresses of an unknown people, spread over the extensive regions of the West, we behold the memorials of a once powerful race which was exterminated or has disappeared to make room for the existing savage tribes. Philanthropy could not wish to see this continent restored to the condition in which it was found by our forefathers. What good man would prefer a country covered with forests and ranged by a few thousand savages to our extensive republic, studded with cities, towns, and prosperous farms, embellished with all the improvements which art can devise or industry execute, occupied by more than 12 million happy people, and filled with all the blessings of liberty, civilization, and religion? The Removal Act paved the way for the forced expulsion of tens of thousands of American Indians from the Cherokee tribe in 1838-39 into the West in an event widely known as the Trail of Tears, a forced resettlement of the Indian population. This event has been characterized as a genocide. The first removal treaty signed was the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek on September 27, 1830, in which Choctaws in Mississippi ceded land east of the river in exchange for payment and land in the west. The Treaty of New Echota was signed in 1835 and resulted in the removal of the Cherokee on the Trail of Tears. The Seminoles and other tribes did not leave peacefully, as they resisted the removal along with fugitive slaves. The Second Seminole War lasted from 1835 to 1842 and resulted in the government allowing them to remain in South Florida swampland. Only a small number remained, and around 3,000 were removed in the war. A legal case that took place in 1832 by the United States Supreme Court, which held a final vote, 5-1, affirming that the states did not have the right to impose regulations on Native American land. Despite President Andrew Jackson's refusal to enforce the ruling, this ultimate decision led the formation basis for the subsequent law in the United States in regard to Native Americans.